Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Municipal podcast. My name is Tina Nza, and I'm with my co-host, Nosipo. And we are going to give you all the information that you want concerning how your local government works and how you can actually participate in your local government. So, Nosipo, it's quite good that we decided to launch our first podcast by bringing in a very important person in the local government sphere.
I'm excited about it. I'm so excited.
Everyone, please welcome our guest, Trevor Fowler.
Thank you.
We call you the local government guru.
Let's hope I am.
Oh, you are.
Oh, yeah, Trevor, you've got a wealth of knowledge when it comes to local government. In fact, this is one of the reasons why we thought for our episode, before we can actually talk about all that has happened over the past 25 years. As you know, this year we are celebrating 25 years of local government. There are so many challenges that have come through our system, and there's so much citizen apathy lamenting against local government. But 25 years later, how did we imagine this local government? I mean, Trevor, we know you've played a very critical role in terms of participating in the negotiation, in the formation of local government. And obviously, during that time, you and your team had a certain vision of how local government should be. But then we find that 25 years later, there are some cracks in the system. Obviously, you come from a wealth of experience because you've once been an MEC of development planning and local government in Gauteng. You've also been a city manager at some point. So we thought, let's tap into your information, into your wealth of information, just to give us a historical lens into the formation of local government so that we get to understand exactly what was the main objective and how it was envisioned. So, take us back.
So I think the key issue is that people kind of look at local government now and they don't look at the long history.
Yes.
And, the negotiations were commenced probably around 92, 93 in local government. But that's the formal negotiations. There were, negotiations long before that in places like Johannesburg. There was a forum that included Tato Wutlana and others. Even our current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, was a part of that forum that was negotiating for a better arrangement in local government in Gauteng, in Johannesburg in particular. But the preparations to do those negotiations started quite a couple of years before. Around 92 or so, the ANC had set up a department that dealt with subnational government. At that point, it wasn't about local government, it was subnational government. And it included people like now Dr. Tozemele Botha, who was then a member of the NEC, Olive Shisana, Job Makoro, myself, were some of the people. There were many others, I wouldn't name all of them, but those were some of the people. And the team really went around the country to many of the largest cities and larger municipalities. So to what was then Durban, Cape Town, etc., to try to establish negotiating fora. It was an interesting process because in the Western Cape, it was the one place where the ANC had members who were actually employed in the municipality at fairly senior levels. And these were, activists. Many of them are white activists. And I recall one of the things that was raised at that, when we had a discussion with them about setting up the negotiating force. They said, "Oh, no, we don't negotiate with the enemy."
Oh, yeah.
So These fora then were established around the country. But at the same time, the World Bank, which was in discussion with the apartheid government, also decided that they would establish, do some missions, some what they call urban missions into the country. They did about 4, I think. But they had discussions with the democratic movement, which included the ANC, and myself and Tozameli Botha, Olaf Shisana, Job Mokoro, who was premier of the Northwest, and myself were a part of those missions because it was felt by the democratic forces that we must be a part of it to understand it.
Yeah.
And interestingly, some of the information we got was was really an abundance of information that we didn't have access to before, because the World Bank, the people who were then in local government from the apartheid regime said, look, if we open up our books, they'll see how things are going, they'll give us money. And there were interesting conclusions. One, first of all, that the black local authorities had collapsed. And the administration of local government was really in dire straits across the country. So this belief that, it was something that the apartheid regime led by de Klerk did because they wanted to, not altogether true. Things were on they were in dire straits. So they, at national level, provincial, they had provincial administrations. They were all functioning. But at local level, things were really falling apart. Except for some of the big metros like Joburg and Cape Town, etc. There was also an interesting discovery that they made, which I found quite interesting at the time when we were doing the research, that the taxi industry was one, from a price perspective, was one of the most efficient in the world from a price perspective. Now, it didn't deal with the safety and all of the
Everything
other
else.
Because at the time, if you recall, which continued for a good probably 8 or 9 years after democracy, and even still occurs today, the violence in the taxi industry was really quite significant at that time. So soon after that, the local government negotiating forum was established. And there were delegations from the apartheid municipalities and also from the provincial administrations. On the National Party side, it was led by Tertius Delport. And it included, from the Democratic side, the ANC, representative from the ANC, SANCO, South African Communist Party, SAMO, who were members of COSATU. SAMO was a branch of COSATU. And those again included Toza Mile, Olaf Shisana, Letisa Tsenodi, the former deputy speaker, and acting speaker when in the last few months before the elections. Moses Mayakiso, who a lot of people knew as Mas Mayakiso. There was an international campaign when he was imprisoned prior to the early 90s, and he was released as a result of that campaign. Another person from the Western Cape, Samu Salimani. And then there was also a person by the name of John Morby, who was also from the Western Cape. Though the Democratic delegation had an advantage because we were negotiating in English, and all of us were activists who had a vision for the future. Now, the delegation from the apartheid regime were mostly Afrikaner. And they said, look, we think this is unfair. We must negotiate in Afrikaans. So we said, okay, if you want to use your own language, then we'll do ours too. So we'll speak in English, we'll speak in Xhosa, Sesotho. The headhunter said, no, that's one more. So we negotiated in English.
Sure.
And of course, they didn't have that clearer vision of what the future is because they wanted to maintain the status quo.
The status quo, yeah.
And so we had a significant advantage. And as a consequence, we really achieved significant change in the structure of local government that we negotiated there. But the forum was a substructure of CODESA. So it finally went back to CODESA, where Tertius Delport was a part of. And of course, some concessions were made during negotiations at CODESA. So the transitional government was not as the way we had negotiated originally.
Yeah.
We had achieved much. We later achieved it through through then negotiation on the constitution.
Yes.
But we had made some achievements earlier on.
So in other words, the negotiation process also contributed towards the formation of the constitution as well, the negotiations for local government.
Yes. No, so there was a forum that was part of the negotiations.
Yeah. And what was the attitude of the former regime during that period? Because remember, you're trying to form a new local government system where it will no longer represent the racialized spatial, demarcations and economic inequalities. So what was the attitude?
And if I may add, Tina, not just the former apartheid regime, because there were homelands as well. What was the attitude of those that controlled those areas? From a personal perspective, KwaMashu, I'm from eThekwini, KwaMashu fell under Zulu government and it wasn't under the Natal government. And I suspect that there may have been some tensions.
Look, the tensions were exhibited both at local level, where, as I said, we were negotiating largely with the apartheid regime and their representatives, who were almost all of them white. And their attitude really was that they wanted to maintain the status quo. So one of the key areas they wanted to achieve, and part of the reason that they wanted provincial government, they wanted to ensure that you had many local structures so that they could really have control of some of the local structures. So how the structures in the end worked out was very different, and the way we envisioned it was different than what they had in mind. And the reason, so you have some replica, something that exists today, which is Oranje. That's really what they wanted to do. So they wanted to create a Sandton and an observatory in Cape Town and control those. And then all those had all the resources, so things wouldn't change much. And that was really what their strategy was.
Yeah.
And even provincial government was not really in the plans of the democratic government or of the ANC at the time. And so it was in a sense, was a compromise to establish provincial government. That's why we have national police and the national, so it's a national police force, because part of it was really to ensure we don't have this fragmented environment where we would have little control. So I think what happened with the black local authorities and the Bantustans, the IFP and Buthelezi were really standing firm because they wanted greater control.
Yeah.
And they wanted to be in charge. And their that one is, is fairly well documented, where Madiba was able to convince Buthelezi to join the elections, and that only happened at the very last minute. It happened in the elections were in April. It must have happened in March. March. It was very, very late.
Yeah.
In fact, there was a march on the 28th of March that was organized by the IFP that really resulted in quite a few deaths because of the violence between that occurred during that march and the reaction of people that were fighting for democracy, and also the police who didn't quite understand what their government was, what their regime was doing, and so they would just go back to their old ways, but they were uncertain. Because I recall an incident in that march. There was gunfire, and I was not in Shell House, but I was in the provincial ANC offices, which were just across from Shell House. So there were shots that were fired. The police came. They wanted to enter the provincial offices of the ANC. And I remember we were at the top of the stairs, and because there was a set of stairs to get up to the offices. They wanted to come up the stairs. We said, "No, you're not coming in." They were armed, and we said, "No, you're not coming in." And they said, "No, we're coming in." We said, "Over our dead bodies," and they backed down.
Yeah.
It was quite. So it were kind of a reflection of what was happening.
The tensions, yeah. Yeah.
But what happened later with the Bantustan is that many of them realized, the people in power didn't realize, but many of the officials realized that time was up. Yeah. And so that was when the TEC was formed, the Transitional Executive was formed.
Yeah.
And if you recall, in Northwest, the Northwest, or what was then, what was called?
Poputetswana?
Poputetswana,
Yeah.
So BOP, the original BOP. Those police and army, remember they shot these
The AWP.
AWB people, which then, really let people know that, change was happening. And of course, when provinces were drawn, many of the people were drawn from the Bantustan. So, for instance, Mangope's daughter was a part of the technical committee that drew the boundaries of the province. So I was also a part on that committee from engineering services point of view, part of that negotiations, because that happened before the elections, drawing of the provincial boundaries.
What was the basis of those boundaries?
The way the boundaries were drawn, they were based on the fact that you had discussions. The committee had discussions with people. It had public meetings all over the country about what the boundary should be. And what was used was really something that assisted quite a bit. The Development Bank had drawn what they call development regions.
Okay.
So those development regions formed the basis of what the new provincial boundaries would be.
Okay.
So in the development region for Gauteng, for instance, was much larger. So it went much further south, included Sasolburg, the oil facility.
Vereeniging.
beyond Vereeniging.
Van der Bijl.
Van der Bijl, include Van der Bijl, went quite a bit way into the Free State. And on the Mpumalanga side included the, there was a 1, 2 street there called Kwandebele.
Kwandebele, yes.
So Kwandebele, that area was included.
Yeah.
But at the time of the negotiations and listening to people, the Kwandebele said, look, there are no chiefs in Gauteng. We're not going to be a part. So it was excluded at Kudesa.
Okay.
The final drawing was excluded.
Then how did we move from the development boundaries to the ward boundaries?
The wards, that happened a bit later. Wards weren't in place until the 2000s. Yeah. And it was only put in place after the new constitution. So there weren't wards in the transitional period. So the transitional period was probably, well, up to 97, when after 96, when the constitution was adopted. Then then wards were put in place. So in the 2000 elections, there were wards. So the first local government elections were in 1995, and transitional councils were put in place. Those remained in place until 2000, after the local government elections.
So initially it means that from 2005 up until around 1998, 2000, stretching up to 2003, there was still an ongoing process of developing local government legislation.
Yes,
during that
absolutely.
period. So it took quite a while.
It took a while.
Yeah.
So the Municipal Systems Act, the Structures Act were all developed later.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so it's developed between 94 and 99.
In 1999. And what role did the World Bank and other economic agencies, international economic agencies, play in supporting South Africa to finally consolidate local government, and also maybe have a role in influencing the way in which we have adopted the kind of structure that we have in local government?
So the World Bank played a role, but South Africa took a position which said, we don't want to borrow money from the World Bank. And the reason is that they were afraid of what we refer to as structural adjustments. So the position was that we did not want money from the World Bank, but there were others, such as the EU, which gave money. So there was an organization called INLOGOV, the Institute for Local Government Research. It was set up around, actually it grew out of something was set up in the early 90s, about 92. And Tozameli Botha was at the time, the CEO of it, and it was based in the Western Cape. And then INLOGOV grew out of it. Yeah, so there were quite a few structures in different areas. So you had what was called Health Systems Trust. Health Systems Trust was also established. It was established between the apartheid government and the democratic forces. And that, so when Nkosazana Zuma was the first, she was on that board originally. I was appointed to the board in 92, and she was on there until about 93 or so. And so they developed the district, the health district, etc. The Health Systems Trust.
It sounds like, there was a traditional wedding and then there was the white wedding. So as much as we always refer to the establishment of local government, and you look at 2000 as the establishment of local government, the Lobola negotiations and the slaughtering of the cow happened way before that.
Yeah.
Okay.
There was a lot of negotiations at one time. Yeah.
And then initially, I'd like to really get to understand the thinking behind of adopting the kind of devolved, decentralized system that we have in South Africa. Because, for example, when I look at Kenya, their devolution landed up at county council level, and all responsibilities relating to local government are at that level while they continue to have their cities and their local towns. But then in Uganda, they chose the district to be the main service deliverer of local government. But for us, we have metropolitan areas, we've got districts, we've got local municipalities. So what was really the thinking around that devolved system of local government?
Well, interestingly, it's not quite as devolved as one may believe, right? So it is a devolved system, but let's just look at the creation of metros in particular.
Yeah.
So metros are based on several commercial, there should be several commercial centers, and there would be a single metropolitan municipality to facilitate the area integration of the areas around these commercial centers. Right? So that's what ended up in the Constitution finally. But in the initial way it was done, you had Sandton, you had Randfontein, you had not Randfontein, Randburg, etc. All these areas that were almost towns in their own councils, etc. So when the negotiations were taking place, they wanted, the apartheid regime wanted to create a system that said you have a metro and you have these local structures. And
So
the negotiations
Stocksburg, Germiston would remain local in that sense.
Right.
Okay.
And so what we took the position to say, okay, if you've got a metropolitan area, it must have structures, local structures, not a metro that is there, and then you have all these structures that are completely autonomous. So you have a metro with structures. And in 1990, from 95 to 2000, you had many of these structures, but they didn't form the same, they didn't have the same boundaries as the old Randburg, Sandton, etc. They had different boundaries. And the boundaries were drawn in a way that always included an area where poor people live, where black people live, etc. So that it integrated, so that they looked rather strangely initially because these local structures existed. The new constitution, of course, got rid of those local structures for metros. And the part of the reason is that if you weren't able to tap into the philosophy was one municipality, one tax base. So if you weren't able to tap into this overall tax base, you wouldn't change the way things move. Soweto would be its own municipality, but people there can't pay rates and taxes, or don't pay rates and taxes. Wouldn't pay enough rates and taxes to be able to change the environment. So you needed to include a Sandton, etc., so that the money that is raised in the Johannesburg metro area, the Kuruleni metro area, is spread throughout. And that was really the philosophy.
So it's sort of like adopting the cross-subsidization
essentially
into it.
Yeah. So part of there are two things that kind of shaped what we currently have. The first is you had to get people who were in government that understood what we needed to achieve. So it meant in municipalities, as in the provinces and in national government, many of the experienced white administrators no longer had those positions. The constitution, the interim constitution, did allow for some of them to remain in place. Right? So, for instance, in water affairs nationally, the first Minister of Water Affairs was Kadi Rasmal. And I was even though I was Speaker of the West of Gauteng, I was also his advisor because my expertise is in water supply engineering, etc. And the DG that was there was retained. Right? One of the few places where it happened, he was retained.
Okay.
But very soon, what we knew to be the case was that he didn't understand what we were doing. So he said, look, after a year, he said, look, I would like to leave because we've set up the new structures administratively, but the overall vision, what you want to achieve, I don't understand. And so he asked to resign. But so as a consequence, you had people probably in a different society, the people who were then in government would probably have been fairly senior in government, right? But they didn't have the training.
Yes.
So
Yes.
nobody had a training in government. The first time we saw how government works was when you went in. So nobody. There may be those who worked in other countries on the continent. Some of them may have been employed in government, but not that many. But they lived in a place where they understood how government works, etc. So you had some of the exiles that had that experience.
I remember in 2000, Tina, and I was still very fresh was I still at varsity? I can't remember though. But when the first IDPs were done, and I was in eThekwini, and the interesting that was happening between the older administrators and the newer ones were very brave to say, we are all learning the system of local government together. You may have 30 years of experience in the old system, but this new one, we're learning it together. So there was that sense of everyone trying to understand what it is, to a point that the very first IDPs that were developed in 2000, nobody knew how to do it, because for the first time, some of the officials had to go to townships, to Indian areas, and engage, something that they'd never done before. And it was interesting.
Just an incredible
No, absolutely. And even at the provincial level, it was required that you have to consult. Consultation with communities was an important part. And that was something that, though organizations did it, and you had street committees, but if you do it in a state context, it's slightly different. You have to figure out how to do it. And that's one of the big areas. So the point I was making was that some of the roots of where we are today relates to the fact that we just didn't have enough officials who understood the system, that had the skills. So now there are many of the officials that were there previously, those who stayed, are a part of the new system. And I know in Joburg, there was somebody, not just in Joburg, but in Gauteng province and national, there were people that were employed from age 17 or 18, white people that were there. And they've fully integrated into the system. So they stayed and made the transition. There were many others who just didn't want to stay, didn't leave. And left. But in essence, the advent of democracy was liberation for black people. But it was also liberation for white people. Because when you have a system of authoritarian system, it affects everybody in the system, both black and white. And so they would grow up not thinking, I'm going to be a teacher, I'm going to be this. But as time progressed, they then understood that, I don't have to be a teacher, I can be entrepreneur. And I met a chap once who said, no, democracy is the best thing for me, because I I run a business, I'm very successful.
Mm.
So the understanding that people should have is that the liberation was for both black and white. And white people probably benefited more than black people did, or the majority of black people did.
Yeah.
Right? Because they had the skills already. They had the education, their children had the education. So the children went into the new system that was now internationalized, because we were recognized internationally, held in high esteem internationally. So they were able to spread their wings as in business and in various other ways.
Yeah. And I find it quite interesting that you're really touching on the issue relating to to the capacity, of municipal officials at that time, where it was quite limited. But one would have had an expectation, Trevor, that over the years it would have improved. And one of the problematic areas that we are identifying right now, 25 years later, is the lack of capacity in local government. Why is that? What happened along the way?
Look, I think that's a question that there's a period from up to 2000 probably, from 94 to about 2000, maybe slightly longer. The people that went into government, as I said, you had kind of a pressure cooker kind of situation where people were not allowed to actualize themselves, and black people in particular. So they weren't allowed to actualize, and so they were a part of government. But as soon as the pressure got removed, people were trained. Many of those that were trained didn't really want to be in government. They were activists. They ended up in government. They had visions of doing something else in life. Right? So I had a vision of being, practicing civil engineering, but I ended up in government. And there are many people like that. And so they then left and went to other places. So then, of course, in the normal system, what would happen is that people who were trained would then come into the system. But of course, our apartheid affected all sectors of our society. So you can't say that in 94, all of a sudden the education system is going to be right. And in 20 years' time, you're going to have all these educated people that were able to take government. Even though they may have been in their late teens, it wasn't going to happen. So even we saw at Wits, for instance, people who were coming in the early 90s, early to middle to late 90s, young black people weren't making it in the sciences. They weren't making it because the education system didn't give them the basis to be able to succeed. And the universities were a bit bureaucratic, and they said, no, a degree, 4-year degree is a 4-year degree. And I said, listen, if you have a 4-year degree and somebody's going to take 5 years to do it, why do you want them to fail the first year and then do it? It took several years for that mindset to change when they put in bridging programs, etc. So when you look at you have to look at the history in the full context to understand that people who could have been trained were not trained adequately because we just didn't have the system wasn't in place to ensure that.
And how much outside of the capacity? Now, the challenges with local government, some argue that it's more the capability than the capacity that is really dealing with the system of local government. Your views on that, meaning the conditions affected by the politics and everything else, which makes it, even with the most qualified person with the good intentions, they're not able to do what they can do best.
Look, I think there are two things. The first is, and about 47% of the current officials in local government weren't properly placed, and they're not adequately skilled. And part of it, so the point I'm making is that others went into the private sector. Those that decided to go into government, now, 30 years later, we should have people who are trained.
Sure.
But they are trained in a system, and they weren't activists, so they don't understand the new system. And essentially there are some weaknesses, so people become technocrats. Right? They become technocrats, and when you want to change something, you have to go outside of your comfort zone. You have to be able to transform it.
Yeah.
And that was really one of the key things that happened from 94 to 99. There was a transformative culture, transformative way of thinking. And currently, though we still talk about transformation, the ease to do it is not as quite as simple. So if you look at it from, let's say, from a revenue perspective, the revenue that you are able to achieve, there's a decision you have to make that is contrary to what you think should happen. And what I'm saying is that if you take Johannesburg, and it's not true of Johannesburg only, it's true of most of our municipalities or tertiary municipalities, secondary municipalities, not the rural ones. But if you take those municipalities, 65% to close to 70% of Johannesburg's income comes from 35% of the households.
Yeah.
So the majority of the households, the 1.1 of the 1.1 million households in Joburg, the majority only pay about 30%, between 30 and 35%. So when you go in, you say, well, we have to get the cash. So how do you get your cash? If somebody doesn't get a service, they have roads that are potholes, etc., they're not going to pay you.
There's no incentive. Yeah.
Right? They're not going to pay you. Whether they're black or whether they're white, they're not going to pay you. So you have to tar those roads so that you can get the income and then use the income to subsidize. But when people go in, they'll say, no, but that's wrong. We should be putting services into the poorer areas first. That's where you should put all your money. Now, if you put all your money there and you don't put money into where the money is generated, you won't generate it. So it's a contradiction. So you're the people that have, you're giving it to them so that they can give you money, so you use that money to ensure that the people who don't have, and that you have cross-subsidy.
It'd be interesting, Tina, in the future episodes to maybe speak to someone from one of the cities and see how this has affected them, because I have a suspicion that some of the challenges that are faced by some of the cities was trying to balance this, expanding services to areas that didn't have services, and at the same time trying to make sure that those that had are still kept happy. And it's a very delicate balance that I suspect needs to be done.
Absolutely. I mean, in Johannesburg, when I was city manager, that was really conceptually what we had to do. There was a problem of potholes, there was all these. So we said, look, if you deal with the potholes, Johannesburg doesn't have a problem with finances if you are able to collect it. The problem you have now is they're not collecting it. And so their capital expenditure has gone down. Joburg's current capital expenditure should be at 13 billion. If you want to go annually, 13 billion. if you compare it to what was being spent in 2016.
Yeah.
Because then you were spending about 10. Now, if you take inflation, etc., it would be about 13 billion. But they're spending 5.
Yeah.
It's less than, it's a third of what they should be spending. So the question is, how do this contradiction is something people have to understand to be able to deliver the services. And it's not just true in municipalities. It's true nationally. So from 2009 to 2017, money was spent in providing social services. But if you spend money only on social services, you are not able to stimulate the economy that's going to generate the tax revenue that you will be able to address it. And that's one of the key things that happened. There are two things that happened. One is that issue, and then from 2008 to 2017, the commodity prices went down for that entire period, and so that also affected our ability to have funds because of the decline in commodity prices. Though commodities are not our main income area, but it's certainly our main generator of foreign exchange.
And I think, you know what, Trevor, we have already started a conversation that I was thinking that we should actually have in the next season, because we actually want to unpack the whole idea of a local government that is financially self-sustainable and viable. And currently there are quite a lot of debates if whether the white paper on local government, particularly in terms of its finances and being able to raise its revenue, had actually imagined a local government that would in the reality be able to do that. So it comes back to the fiscal and financial framework of local government that is currently being reviewed as well. So most probably we should have a conversation about that, because at least you have sat in the fiscal commission previously.
The white paper that was white paper on local government envisioned local government generating its own funds. So it's possible for the metros to generate their own funds, and they do receive a equitable share, which is a small percentage of their total income. When you go to a rural municipality, that's where you have problems, because there you don't have people that are middle class to generate the funds that can be subsidized. So if you then say local government's going to generate its own funds, it's not going to happen. So there are all kinds of things that happened as a consequence, for instance, of the struggle for change. So the capital that is received for housing, for instance, comes from the province. And the problem is their target is the number of houses. So how do you build the number of houses? You buy the cheapest land. Where is the cheapest land? It's outside. So we reinforce the apartheid spatial planning and outcomes with this, with some of the philosophies that are there. And it's because people don't understand that what you've got to be able to do is to spend a little more so that you change change the spatial planning, because the spatial planning and or the current spatial situation, the poor live outside of the cities. They spend 50 to 60% of their income not on food as they should be, but on transport. And that's why spatial planning is such an important thing, and why it's important for even the provinces and those in government to understand that when you spend money, you can't spend it on the poor. I mean, on the poorest land. Let's put it that way. You can't take the cheapest land. You can't spend it on the cheapest land. You must take land that changes that dynamic.
My grandmother would say cheap is expensive.
Well, Trevor, thank you so much for joining us for this episode. No, we definitely look forward to inviting you for the next season, particularly to deal with the issue of the fiscal framework in local government. I think you would be the correct person who can actually have this conversation and discussion with us. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us in the first episode. Please watch out for our second episode. We will now be dabbling into electoral systems in local government. Otherwise, please do subscribe to this podcast. And we'd like to thank EPF, Empire Partner Foundation, for making this episode possible. Next time, cheers. Bye.